we're going to split this event into two parts. In the first part, I will be speaking about the experience of isolation and of writing and of surviving and thriving in isolation for Stus. And in the second half, we're going to focus on the poetical side of things. We're going to actually look at some texts and analyze them. So as far as the first part is concerned, I'm not going to go into detail about Stus's biography because I imagine that many of you would know about it. But in any case, what is truly important and remarkable for us today is that Stus went through an experience of isolation too. And of course, his experience was much more extreme as a dissident in the Soviet Union who spent more than 13 years of his life, the final 13 years, we should say, of his life in imprisonment and labor camps and exile. And someone who in 1983 was even punished by a whole year of solitary confinement. It is truly difficult for us to even imagine, to start to imagine what kind of an experience one is going through in those circumstances. And that, of course, puts our experience into perspective as well. And if we go a bit back, in 1972, that was a really turning point for Stus because that was the year when Stus was arrested and when this whole journey of this open resistance against the Soviet regime started. And beg your pardon. In 1972, Stus had a truly exceptional experience between January and September, where he spent 9 months in this preliminary custody awaiting his trial. Now, we know now that in the end, Stus would get this 5+3, as it was called, sentence, right? 5 years of labor camps and 3 years of exile. But at the time, Stus didn't know it. And in fact, he was desperately trying to write letters to the highest authorities in the Soviet Union to explain to them that I did not commit any crime, that there must have been a mistake. So at that stage, perhaps in a slightly naive way, Stus imagined that that could be changed. But he had that experience of 9 months of near complete isolation in any case. And I would like us to focus on those 9 months today, both in terms of discussing his isolation experience and in terms of getting into his text, getting into his poetry. So between January and September 1972, Stus managed to create one of his major collections, his volume eloquently entitled A Time of Creativity. And so I would like us today to talk about how we could turn this experience of isolation that we all of a sudden are going through nowadays ourselves into an experience of surviving and even thriving, in other words, in a time of creativity. So I thought that perhaps just trying to learn some survival and thrival techniques or tips, if you will, from Stus might be extremely helpful and soothing for us. And I thought that perhaps we could speak about 4 of those. So 4 tips of survival and thrival from Stus. And I hope that you are ready for some poetry and that you have your cup of tea as well as I do as well. And I think that we are ready to go. So first of all, as I mentioned, this idea of turning this most intense time into a time of creativity. In fact, there are so many of us. I can see that at the moment there are 66 people who have joined us, and this is extremely fantastic that we get to connect in such a way. And we all go through our own circumstances, but what we can say for sure is that for all of us, this is a really intense time and really unprecedented and unexpected time in many ways. And we do find it difficult for different reasons. Everyone has got their own reasons, but it is all the more the reason for us to turn this experience into something creative, because as much as this time is so difficult, it is also a time of opportunity. And this is exactly how Stus was treating it. And so I will just switch on the slides. This is another part of some fun here, exploring this new format. And so this is the place in so-called Pen 36 labor camp, where Stus, in 1983, as I mentioned, spent a whole year in solitary confinement, and later in 1985 died. But I would like us to go a bit back and focus on this time of creativity, right between January and September 1972. You can see that the title of the collection that Stus chose is Czas Twórczości / Dichtenszeit. We're going to talk shortly about why Stus decided to use the German title as well, what it means too. But I just wanted to share with you this photo that I took at the archive. And at the bottom of it, you will see this phrase, finis coronat opus, right? The outcome or the result crowns the effort or crowns the work. And we will come back to this line slightly later. But this is the photo that I really wanted to show you. You will see those numbers that Stus wrote in pencil, right? 25, 26, 27. So those are the marks that Stus made for himself, marking those bits that he wanted to translate every single day. So this time, those 9 months, indeed proved to be a time of creativity for Stus, because within that time he managed to write more than 300 original poems. 300 original poems, let me just reiterate that, within 3 months. And on top of that, he managed to translate more than 200 poems by Goethe. And so now those are passages that Stus marked for himself that he was going to translate. And exceptionally, in Dichtenszeit, under each poem, we have the date. And it almost feels like this collection is a sort of diary for Stus, where he shares his experiences, emotional and psychological experiences of going through this. And in fact, I really hope that after this talk, you will get a chance to find online, or perhaps some of you have printed version of volume 3 of this 12-volume edition of Stus's works, which contains Czas Twórczości Dichtenszeit, where every single poem is dated, and you can even go to the dates that we have nowadays, right? So you can go to April and just read a poem a day, because it was, or even more, because it was Stus's task that he set for himself to write at least a poem a day and translate a certain number of lines by Goethe. And you will see when you look at this collection as well, that on some days Stus wrote not just one poem, but on some days up to 5 poems a day. And they wouldn't be really monotonous in terms of style and in terms of ideas and images. There would be some wonderful variety there. So it is truly remarkable that he managed to achieve that. And I really hope that will serve as this uplifting and encouraging example for us as well. And so that is tip number 1, as it were. Let us try and turn this time of isolation into a time of creativity. Which leads me to the second point that I wanted to share with you, again, availing ourselves of Stus's experience of poetry as our guide these days, which is that this is a truly remarkable and exceptional time. And you do not need me to say that, because I think that, first of all, you know that yourself full well, and second of all, I think that everyone who has been able to speak these days has already said that. But the way in which I think it is probably not so obviously exceptional is the fact that I suggest that during this time, we truly become much more sensitive and much more tuned into arts and culture and poetry. And it is precisely because of this reason that these days we can finally take our earplugs out and listen, right? Listen to each other, listen to the other, listen to poetry, listen to arts, and listen to ourselves. As far as listening to ourselves is concerned, we're going to move to that in a second. But I just wanted to stop here for a second to speak about this idea of really tuning in and really listening. At this time, we are finally able to find the time and to look at poetry in a different way. What I mean by it is that we're living through really big times. In fact, this time makes me think back to the Euromaidan revolution times. And those of you who went through that experience would definitely remember how it felt like it was our epic moment. And it didn't feel like we would ever actually live through anything like that, anything similar to that. And at the moment, this COVID experience they were going through, the way it's changing the world actually does remind me in many ways of the Euromaidan experience. And so these are big times. And when big times are there, we finally are able to read poetry in a completely different way and really hear it. Because in the pre-COVID world, right, I think that these days, some more neologisms are going to be coined. Pre-COVID world, post-COVID world, hopefully post-COVID world is going to be much more optimistic and full of hope and mutual respect than the post-truth world. And so in this post-COVID, or rather COVID world, as we're going through it, we are finally able to really hear poetry and really connect to it in a completely different way. Somehow what might have seemed to us to be quite even old-fashioned or irrelevant from Stus's experience, KGB system was so, it seems like it was long ago. Nowadays, all of a sudden, acquires a completely different meaning for us. So I think that this is tip number 2, to really try and treat this time as a unique time to rediscover our relationship with arts. And for Stus, of course, this a really special way to do that was through his relationship with Goethe and his poetry. And every single day he would really connect with this incredible writer and really try and forget about the mundane experiences of interrogations and solitude that he had, and really find something that would be more than himself. And I think that this idea of there being something more than ourselves is something that is at the very heart of arts, and that we hopefully can really appreciate during this time. So that is that is tip number 2 for you from Stus. Availing of ourselves of this unique time to tune in to poetry and art, and to really make sure that we find something that is greater and bigger than ourselves. Tip number 3, facing ourselves. So what is quite special about Stus's poetry, as many of you will know, is that in fact it provided this absolutely innovative and unique way to explore the self. And Stus's choice and Stus's remedy against the distressing and traumatic external experience that he had was to go inwards, right? And to make the self the center of exploration, the subject of his poetry, both as its subject, both as its lyrical hero, but also as its subject matter. Because in fact, when we read Stus's poetry, we expect that, as it is the case with other pieces of poetry, we can just embark on this journey and the lyrical hero is going to lead the way. But in fact, in Stus's poetry, we see that the lyrical hero or the lyrical subject doesn't lead the way. The lyrical subject is the way. And so being on this journey, and together with Stus's poetry, being able to finally face those questions that we have been really postponing until a later point in our life, finally being able to ask the right questions and have the courage to think about them, reflect upon them, and answer them, is something that we perhaps might choose for ourselves to do these days. Of course, there are so many things on offer, and every single day we get ever new articles where we have ever new lists of films and books to read. But I suppose that as much as that is extremely important, and for some of us, that might be the most healing remedy these days, I also want to invite us to think about it in a bit of a different way, that perhaps we should try not miss the point now, whereas there is this chance for us to really spend some time with ourselves and observe ourselves. And for that, sorry for jumping a bit, let me just, well, anyway, probably, yes, I'm not going to focus on that for now. But for that, I just wanted to share with you this incredible multiple or multi-layered nature of the word dichten that Stus has in the title of his collection, Dichtenszeit, right? We might remember. For those of you who do not know German, a Dichtenszeit essentially consists of two parts, right? Zeit meaning time. So for example, in Heidegger's work, his monumental work, being in time, sein und Zeit, this word is used as well. And dichten is the other part. So time of creativity is one way to translate it. But what is so remarkable about this word is that in fact, it combines two meanings. So on the one hand, it does mean, and you can see here a photo from the dictionary that Stus was using, this German Russian dictionary, where dichten on the one hand means to create, right? And more specifically to write, and more specifically to write and create poetry. But at the same time, dichten also means to condense, to compress. And that truly shows us the nature of poetry in many ways, because what makes poetic language so different to the everyday language that we use, to these banal phrases that we repeat time and again, is exactly the fact that those words the poets use, and especially really dense poets like Stus, they're just like crystals with many facets that we just get to explore. And for us to be able to really make a pause, stop, forget about everything around, and just really focus on it, to unravel this mystery, to undo this knot, if you will, of poetry, to really focus on one word and think about what it means. And of course, this is poetry provides so much richness for that, because and we will talk a bit about that a bit in the second part as well. He is someone whose language is truly exceptional, replete with archaisms and dialecticisms and neologisms and obsolete words, those words that truly make us stop and wonder, actually stop in wonder. That's probably the best way to put it. I can already see Ursula there, which is a sign that I should wrap it up, and I will do within a minute. I'll try to do my best. So in this sense, dichten also means really condensing, but also part of it is sealing. And Stus himself uses this notion of sealing the self, right? So nowadays it might be a really good chance for us to seal the self and to that way learn about ourselves and to observe ourselves in this situation. And the final thing to say, truly within a few seconds, is imagining the post-COVID world, right? What is going to be the world when we wake up to it? Stus is so often confined to this idea that he was someone who was opposing the regime, and that was the main idea and the main significance of his work. But in fact, Stus chose a much more complex way of looking for authenticity, which is the way of not fighting against, but fighting for, not freedom from, but freedom for. The freedom for making ourselves, creating this image of ourselves. So truly making sure that during this time, we're trying to think not only about the COVID experience that we're going through at the moment, but thinking beyond it. What are we going to take with us once this nightmare blows over? How are we going? In what ways are we going to be different? And this is where this phrase about finis coronat opus comes back into our conversation, because it means that the result crowns the work. So what is going to be the crown? And coronat here is quite poignantly relevant these days as well. What is going to be the crown that we are going to be proud of at the end of this experience? I'm going to pause that, and I'm going to pass the floor to Ursula.
Bohdan, thank you so much for that. I I know that I speak for more than just myself when I say that I feel better already. And it was wonderful to be reminded of some of the resources, the inner resources that Stus had to draw on, in particular during this time that we're talking about today of intense creativity during 1972. Can I invite anybody who would like to? I know that there are a couple of questions there already to submit questions in the Q&A. There's a speech bubble button at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to do that now. And can I kick off the questions now, Bohdan, by asking you a couple myself? And the first would be to pick up on something you said about Stus very consciously taking inspiration from other poets. Can you tell us a bit more about what you know about how he used the work of other poets, both as a source of strength for himself and as a source of inspiration for himself as a writer?
Thank you so much for this question, Ursula. I think it is indeed very relevant and very important for us as well to see what were the sources of inspiration for Stus as well. And of course, to list all of the truly important names for Stus would take us a really long time. So I will try and be really, really concise here. But so I've already mentioned Goethe. And in general, I think that, and this is the triad of poets that Stus himself mentioned in one of his letters, where he said that the three most significant poets for him were Goethe, another German language poet, Rainer Maria Rilke, as well, and also a Russian language poet, Boris Pasternak. Boris Pasternak was especially important and significant for Stus, both in terms of his style and in terms of his worldview, if you will, was quite during those quite formative years for Stus, was especially during the early years, right, in those early collections. So this 1972 collection, Distant Side, that really opened the way for palimpsests, which is Stus's magnum opus, is already the collection of a mature poet. And before that, of course, Stus had other collections, and Boris Pasternak and other poets were really important there. Stus also, since I suppose that there are many people joining us from the UK tonight as well, was really influenced and drew this inspiration from English language poets. And this is something actually that, interestingly enough, very often scholars and readers very often overlook. And one of the central figures for him in that respect was T.S. Eliot, someone whom he read quite extensively. Likewise, Ursula and I had a bit of a conversation about it before the event as well, that Stus has these affinities with the metaphysical poets, right, like George Herbert, but especially like John Donne, one of these English metaphysical poets, whom Stus learnt about via Eliot, and we see that in his poetry. But I suppose the two main names for him were precisely Goethe, during especially 1972, and Rainer Maria Rilke. And there are many ways in which their styles are similar, but of course there are many ways in which Stus proves to be a truly original poet too.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We've got questions coming in now, and there's a question from Yuri Bender. So Yuri, we're going to try and turn your video on so that you can ask the question yourself. And then there may be time for a couple more questions after that. Just a second. And then we'll go on to the second part of the evening when we'll look at some of the one of the poems in much more detail.
Perfect.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Yuri, do ask your question.
Well, greetings to everybody. Dobro večera, good evening. Bohdane, thank you so much for your fascinating lecture this evening, which I'm really enjoying immensely. I'd just like to ask you about something about Vasyl Stus. I mean, we must bear in mind at the moment in these dark times the suffering of our brothers and sisters in Donbass. I was on the phone to some people there yesterday in the Donetsk Oblast, and there's a huge shortage of medicines there and medical equipment. And bearing in mind that Vasyl Stus spent much of his early life in Donetsk, what sort of references are there in his work to that time in Donbass and to the experiences of the inhabitants of Soviet Ukraine at that time?
Yuri, thank you so much for this question. Indeed, as you rightly pointed out, Stus, even though he was born near Vinnytsia, right, in Rakhnivka, he spent most of his youth and adult years as well in Donetsk before he moved to Kyiv in 1963, 1964. So he studied in Donetsk, and in the end he left that place to go to Kyiv to do his PhD, where he was expelled from in the end because of his protest. So in fact, many years of his life were spent there. And of course, that was extremely formative for him because Donetsk was one of those most emblematic places in terms of the Russification policies of the Soviet Union. And so in many ways, Stus was being formed in this kind of opposition to the de-Ukrainization and deculturalization as well at this region. In terms of his work and in terms of the references there, well, first of all, what would really invite you to do would be to go back to his prose. Now, again, this would be a subject matter of another, honestly, we do need to have a series of separate events on Stus because there is so much to say about it. But if I were to be really concise about it, I would really suggest looking at his prose first, because he wrote all of his prose works before he was arrested, mostly in the mid-1960s. And I would really suggest looking at those to see those beautiful descriptions of Donetsk, to see what Donetsk was for Stus, to see the landscapes of Donetsk, to see how people lived, how people spoke there, right? What was Stus's relationship with it? I would particularly recommend Stus's story Podróż do Szczęśliwska, a trip to Szczęśliwsk. And Szczęśliwsk, which is a happy town, if we were to translate it into English, for the lack of a better translation, is just a fictional name for Donetsk. And so there, the plot is exactly about Stus going from Kyiv, or rather the narrator going from Kyiv to Donetsk and spending some time there. And in fact, another work that I would really invite you to have a look at is Stus's screenplay. And that's another thing that not many know, that Stus wrote some screenplays too. And so one of them, Russian language one, called Ожидание, Anticipation. So there you will see some more beautiful images of, and not so beautiful as well, of Donetsk. But the final thing to mention here, and of course there are some references in his poetry, and more so in his early poetry rather than the later poetry. And the final note to make here is that as Stus progresses in his style, in his works, he gets ever further away from the material circumstances to this world of abstraction, a world of the self. So it is really fascinating to trace this journey from his quite accurate descriptions of Donetsk in his early works to his self-exploratory poetry in his later work, where some images, where there are some echoes from his Donetsk experiences only. For example, images like Antracit Vedin, right? This image of call of visions, right? So we only see how these material and immaterial worlds collide and becomes fused there. And these Donetsk echoes, as it were, they find their ways into his poetry in very subtle ways.
Thank you very much, Bohdan. Thank you, Yuri, for the question very much. There's time for one more question now, certainly. This is a practical question from Alan Flowers. Alan, if you're there to ask it, about existing translations of Stus's poetry into English and Vera Rich. We'll see if we can get Alan on video. And then there are a couple more questions about the poetry itself, which I think we will be able to cover at the end of the second part. Alan, hi. If you can unmute.
Yeah, hello, Alan. We can hear you, I suppose. hopefully.
I'm not sure we can. Alan, I'm afraid we can't hear you.
Can't.
But we've got your question here. You are saying that you're the executor of Vera Rich, who translated a lot of Ukrainian poets, and you were asking whether Bohdan knows if she translated any Stus.
Yeah, it is a real shame that we cannot hear Alan, but I suppose that, yeah, thank you so much, Ursula, for just telling us what Alan's question is. And I hope it's going to be okay, Alan. Unfortunately, we can't hear you, but the question has been said now, and I'm just going to try and answer it. So Vera Rich, in the first place, is a truly remarkable person, indeed, who translated a lot of Ukrainian poetry and a lot of works of Ukrainian literature in general. And as far as I know, I haven't come across Vera Rich's translations of Stus, of Stus's. So we can see you, Alan, but unfortunately can't hear you still. Yeah, so unfortunately, I haven't come across Vera Rich's translations of Stus's poetry, and in fact, we do face the situation of death of translations of Stus's poetry, and it is a challenge that I'm trying to grapple with at the moment and to change that situation, because it's a very shocking situation that one of Ukraine's most significant poets of the 20th century, and in fact, one of the most exquisite poets, European poets of the 20th century, right? That his works have not been translated. So you can see some selections of translations of his poetry here and there. So at the time when there was this campaign for nominating Stus for a Nobel Prize in Literature in 1984 to 1985, a volume of translations of Stus's poetry was published, but it was at that time the main task was to have some translations, and the quality of those translations could be improved. And recently there have been some attempts in translating Stus, and there have been some selections, and you can find them online as well on the internet. And as far as I know, at Harvard, George Grabovich has been working on some innovative translations of Stus's poetry too. But it's all in the making, it's all in progress. And myself, with my colleagues, we have been also working on rectifying this unfortunate gap, or even a void, we should say. Yes, so I can see a comment as well that, yes, it is quite surprising that there are no references to Vera's translations of Stus. It is indeed surprising, and but what we should bear in mind is that Stus's poetry started to be discovered only in the mid-1990s, right? And so we are still in this process of discovering Stus. And hopefully, you know, when we're going to have another event in a year's time, 2 years' time, we will have a volume in our hands to say that this is Stus, English language Stus for you.
It would be wonderful if that was already in a year, but if it was going to be good, I'm sure we could wait for even longer. There are a couple more questions here, but I think some of them maybe I will put to Bohdan afterwards. I'm conscious of the time, and there's a question here from Marina Paszczynska saying, could you read us one of his poems that you like and talk us through it? And in fact, I think that's what you're going to be doing now. So we're now going to go on to the second part of the event, and we're going to run, as I say, until just before 8 o'clock for those people in the UK who would like to get outside for the clap for our carers. But do please keep on submitting your questions in the Q&A, and as I say, anything that we don't get to, I will make sure Bohdan receives in writing afterwards. So now back to Bohdan for the huge pleasure of this wonderful poem.
Thank you so much, Ursula, and thank you so much for the question as well. And indeed, we are moving, that question really helps us to move to the second part of our conversation, where I would like us to focus on the first poem that Stus wrote in captivity. So this is the poem that opens the collection of Czas Twórczości, Time of Creativity. And it is not one of Stus's most complex poems, and those poems that truly show the intellectual gymnastics that we need to have recourse to in order to understand Stus. But this poem is important because, first of all, it is a recognizable text, and second of all, although still an underexplored text, but second of all, it is an emblematic text. So let us start with this as Stus light, as it were, right? And that will help us to move on to other points that I will make. So because we're so limited for time, bear in mind that these are going to be just entry points into Stus, and hopefully we're going to have more events where we're going to specifically analyze more complex points. I'm going to read it in Ukrainian. I won't read it in English for the considerations of time, but you will be able to find it separately in the Google document. Мені зоря сіяла нині вранці, устромлене вікно, і благодать така ясна лягла мені на душу сумирну, що я збагнув блаженно, ота зоря то тільки скалок болю, що вічністю протятий, мов вогнем. Ота зоря вістунка твого шляху, Христа і долі, ніби вічна мати, вивищена до неба, від землі на відстань справедливості, прощає тобі хвилину розпачу, дає наснагу віри, що далекий всесвіт почув твій тьмяний клич, але озвався прихованим бажанням співчуття та іскрою високої незгоди, бо жити то не є долання меж, а навикання і само собою наповнення. Лиш мати вміє жити, аби світитися, немов зоря. So, why is this poem emblematic and why is it important? Well, first of all, as many of you will recognize, in this poem we have the notable neologism that Stus coins here, and that in fact lays the foundation for Stus's neologistic language and for his whole worldview in an approach in частотворчости and more broadly in palimpsests. And here, by the way, is a photo of the actual poem written by Stus. That's a photo from the archive, and with the help of this arrow, you can also see само собою наповнення in handwriting. So let us try and focus on this most crucial part of this poem. Пожити то не є долання меж, а навикання і само собою наповнення. For living means not overcoming limits, but adjusting and filling self with the self. So I suppose if we start with this idea of overcoming limits, let me just before that make a brief note by saying that the notion of repetition is extremely important for Stus. And that repetition unfolds on so many levels in his poetry. So most practically, there are many variant lines. Whenever he wrote poems, there would be many variants that he would write. And so he, for example, would have the same first line, but that there would be different poems written after this first line, and sometimes completely different poems. Oftentimes that would be caused not only by Stus's style choices, but by his very material circumstances, because many of his poems would be confiscated, and he would need to rewrite his poems from memory. And so that led to the practical consequence that there were many variants of the same poem, or variants that would start with the same line, but not only in terms of this practical side of things, in terms of the imagery that Stus uses, and in terms of those ideas that he comes back to, right? This repetition plays a very important role. And you will see why I mentioned this notion of repetition here, because it is extremely relevant to the notion of limits or edge. So this notion of meja, right, again, limit or edge in English, is something that we see time and again in Stus's poetry. And in fact, in one of his letters, Stus specifically speaks about not repetition, but even repetitiveness of his poetry, right? He says that he keeps on using similar images, especially svichado, for example, this old Ukrainian word for mirror, right? And the same with edge, meja. And Stus repeatedly comes back to them. Now, this idea of repetition, it is something that for Stus is not a mechanic reiteration of the same, but rather it is this repeated coming back to the same existential challenges, to the same existential scenarios, right? In fact, the first thinker who started to talk about this repetition in existential terms was the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard. I'm not going to go into detail about that because that's subject matter of a different conversation and we're short for time. But the way it is really relevant for this poem and for Stus's poetry more generally, this notion of overcoming limits, right? So let me give you a more mundane example. Imagine you have a car and it breaks. What do? Well, you're trying to fix it or you are getting it fixed, right? Hopefully you manage to get it done straight away and you can use your car, you can drive your car. If it doesn't work, we are trying to fix it again. And we're trying to get it fixed. And if that doesn't work, then we just realize, well, this is a crap car, I'm just going to get rid of it. But basically, there is this mindset whereby we have a problem and we have a solution, right? So here, when we talk about this question of repetition, we are dealing with some problems that do not have solutions. In other words, we can fix a car, we can solve this problem, but we cannot solve the problem of love. Well, problem here, I do not mean in terms of it always being nasty and complex and only bringing us some stress. Rather, I mean problem is something that we ponder over, right? In Deleuzean term of the sense of the term, rather, right? This Gilles Deleuze's French philosopher's term of problem. And so questions of love, questions of coming to grips with our finitude, right? Our mortality, the questions of anxiety. So we keep on coming back to the same questions. And it seems to us that I've been here before. Why am I falling into this trap again? But the fact is that this is in the very human nature. And this is exactly what Stus is talking about here in terms of overcoming limits. It is not about this overcoming the limit of our crap car. It is about us not being able to overcome the limits of those existential scenarios that I've just described. They are just irresolvable by their very nature. So living, Stus says, is not about overcoming limits, but it is about adjusting and filling self with the self. Now, these notions of adjusting and samosuboi napovnanya are both extremely important. It is interesting that mostly readers and scholars pay attention to samosuboi napovnanya, which is quite a trademark term for Stus, but hardly ever look at the neighboring term, right? Navykanya, adjusting. And in fact, this term is no less important here because in one of his, I might just, yes, for some reason I don't have that slide here, but probably that's not a problem. Let me go back to the poem. Yeah, so in terms of Navykanya, Stus in one of his essays about another Ukrainian poet, Viktor Kordun, one of Ukraine's remarkable poets from the 1970s, analyzes Kordun's poem called Raptova Osin, a Sudden Autumn, where there is this picture where the Kordun draws this picture of almost apocalyptic picture of this whirlwind, where there is this mixture and hurricane that really picks up houses and trees and cats and other objects and entities. And he says, in that hurricane, the only thing that still makes sense and that keeps this balance is actually not, we should not say not the only thing, but yes, the only element that really keeps the world running and keeps the world sane is this elderly man, he says. He has managed to get used to himself. And Stus writes about these lines in his essay on Cordon, and I invite you to revisit Stus's essays as well. He's a remarkable essayist, not just a poet. And Stus says, so we as humans need to learn how to get used to ourselves, right? How to discover nature, how to get used to this nature that is speaking through us. There is always more than ourselves. That is beyond our anxious mind. So getting used to it. But on the other hand, of course, sometimes we feel like we do not have this nature inside ourselves, or rather we're not sure what that nature is. For that reason, Stus uses the other notion about feeling self with the self, right? Само собою наповнення. Note that here we do not have a subject. This is a process. This is the, if you will, truly trying to catch the tail of our own identity, right? Following the tail of our own identity. Само собою наповнення. This is the very process of making. And actually, this leads us to the origins of the very notion of poetry, which stems from the Greek word poiesis, making, right? So we are in the constant process of making ourselves. And in fact, the very word само собою наповнення enacts this idea of making, right? Of getting filled up. And here Stus might also be in dialogue with Martin Heidegger's notion of being filled up. And in fact, another notion by Martin Heidegger about always not yet is extremely relevant here as well, because this idea of само собою наповнення shows us how we never achieve this state of fullness, right? It is always, we're always in the process of filling ourselves without being filled up. But look at what leads to this, right? The poem starts with this image, very clear, specific image of the star shining at me at dawn, right? So, and this is something that is emblematic of Stus's poetry as well, moving from a very specific stimulus, quite often an image from nature, very often actually daybreak or dawn, and us, or rather the poet, and us with the poet, moving towards this spiritual experience. And that in a miniature version shows us how Stus tends to go from these everyday experiences, overcoming them, to come to this spiritual generalization in the good sense of this word, that in fact pushes to the margins the everyday mundane circumstances we find ourselves in, and moves to the spiritual realm, if you will, that is always greater than ourselves. And here, whereas Stus starts with this quite concrete image of star, notice how at the end of it, he compares this image of mother. Mother alone knows how to live so as to shine as if a star. So star, starting as a clear image, becomes a metaphor. And so the final thing to say, because I'm very aware of time here, and I know that we have only 2 more minutes to go, that in fact Stus's poetry is not about it. Stus's poetry is not a stop, right? Stus's poetry is a journey. It is not a portrait. It is not a replica, a mirror representation of the self. Whereas we have the self and we have the verbal representation of the self, but rather it is the very process of being embarked on the journey. And it is not a portrait, but a drawing class, if you will. So as an entry point into Stus's poetry, and hopefully we'll have a chance to look at some passages where I will be able to showcase in a greater detail, we should remember that it is not about achieving a specific result. It is not always about clearly understanding everything that is going on in the poetry, but it is about being maintained by this flow, by this current of Stus's poetry. And just, thinking back to Ryanair ad, sit back, relax, and enjoy your journey. It is about enjoying this journey as we go. And this is a photo from one of Stus' dictionaries that I found in his private collection. And I find it truly special because this really sums up in a wonderful way Stus's relationship with the language. So here you go, you have this page from a dictionary, and you see how Stus writes a word that is missing there. So this image of Stus adding new words, new vocabulary to your dictionary is something that is really encapsulated by this image. So do you have some other examples here? And I hope that we're going to have a chance to discuss them after this wonderful Club for Our Carers moment. And I suppose I will just stop there, not to run over time, and give us a chance to get ready for the moment of the clapping, and that I'm looking forward to reconvening in a few minutes and hopefully sharing some more of reading Stus and discussing his poetry.
Thank you very much, Bohdan. So we're going to, slightly unusually, but we are in extremely unusual circumstances, all of us, take a very brief break. So those of you who want to go to the door now and are in the UK and take part in that clap, now's a good moment. Otherwise, please do submit your questions in the chat for the end of this session. At 2 or 3 minutes past 8, we will come back together again for Q&A about this particular poem, and I'm hoping to be able to persuade Bohdan to read one more poem before we close. We're also going to take this opportunity, I think you can see it in the chat now, to ask if anybody feels able to. I know we're all in really different circumstances as a result of this lockdown and this quarantine, to make a donation to the Ukrainian Institute London Just Giving page. Now that we've gone online, we are not able to access all the income sources that we have as a general rule, and we would be very grateful for any donation, however small, to help continue to cover the costs of our work, which we try to keep to a minimum. The suggested donation for this evening is £5 if you can manage it. As I say, I know everybody's in very different circumstances at the moment. Perhaps while we pause, and I know some people will be popping outside, we could continue to ask one or two of the questions that we couldn't get round to after the first session. And Laura Brown, I don't know if she's there at the moment, was asking about the screenplays that you mentioned that Stus wrote earlier, and whether the films are available and how it's possible to access those. Is that something, Bohdan, that you know anything about?
Absolutely. So should we go with answering this question, or should we give ourselves a couple of moments for the clap?
Okay, why don't we, fair enough, why don't we all give ourselves a couple of moments? I'm going to pause for a couple of moments, and we will rejoin at 2 minutes past 8. Thank you all. Laura, you had a question about the poem itself, and questions also about Stus's work more generally, I think.
Yes, hello, thank you. So I'll just ask the general questions first. I had wondered, first of all, if any of Stus's screenplays that he wrote had actually been produced, and if so, are those films still around? And also I'd asked what's the best way to be kept up to date on any new translations or other developments? So I don't know if you wanted to answer those first, or if you wanted me to go on to the
yeah, well, why not just answer those quickly, if I may, Laura? Thank you so much. Very good questions. In terms of screenplays, they have not been produced. And to be honest, I'm afraid that most people don't even know that they exist, apart from this coterie group of Stus scholars who really appreciate the great variety and range of his work. And in fact, to be honest, myself, I have been thinking about potentially writing something like of a play based on that, because this screenplay that I mentioned earlier, Ожидание, Anticipation, it has to do with this experience of a dysfunctional family and father and son being separated by the Second World War. But of course, those experiences of the Second World War are extremely poignantly relevant for us nowadays with the war going on in Donetsk. So in many ways, this question of families being separated, people's lives being in many ways traumatized because of this war, and that happening in Donetsk, might actually help to bring this screenplay into life and to give it a new kind of life, and you kind of put it into a new kind of light from this perspective. So hopefully it's all going to happen, but it hasn't happened yet. In terms of the best way to be up to date with it, I'm afraid that at the moment, the effort of working on Stus and the effort in terms of writing on Stus is quite scattered. I wish there was, and I hope again that one day there will be Stus Institute. I think that's a fantastic way to organize it. You know, when I was in Lisbon, I was completely fascinated by this Center of José Saramago. And I was thinking to myself, Stus deserves to have a whole house dedicated to his work, where we could just immerse ourselves in this experience and travel these floors, and at the same time travel the beats of his life, pages of his life, and seeing his work, some images there as well. So I suppose that as whenever we get to this stage where we have a center like that, I'm sure that it will be a great center to guide us in terms of that. But I also want to say that there are not many works written in English language so far, but I would really recommend a couple of resources. So in the first place, there is this fantastic chapter by Natalia Polepyuk, and I would be happy to write that separately, which explores Stus's relationship, or the relationship between Stus and his poetry and the works of the Ukrainian Baroque poet and philosopher Grigory Skovoroda. And it's one of the most insightful English language works on Stus. And second of all, there is a really great resource, which is a more up-to-date resource, just parts of this Courage network. It is a network, beg your pardon, of archival materials about different writers and figures of dissident movement in Ukraine and beyond. And there are quite a few archive materials about Stus and some information about Stus as well. And there are some links and reading list for Stus too. So I would really recommend typing up or looking up Courage, Stus, and you will see this web page where hopefully we'll find some really useful Stus as well.
Thank you. Laura, you had one question about the poem in particular.
Yes, I was wondering about the reference to mother in the last line, or the penultimate line. Is that about Stus's mother in particular, or is it about mothers in general, or something else?
I think that the beauty of poetry, and Stus's poetry definitely, if you will, makes this beauty shine through, is the multi-layered nature of it. Mm-hmm. So, as I mentioned earlier, one of the remarkable features of Stus's Ars Poetica, of his poetics, is the fact that in his works we very often come across a really multi-layered, multifaceted metaphor or use of imagery, and hopefully in a second I will have a chance to actually show you what that looks like in practice. And so, coming back to this specific question about mother, a few things to say here very briefly. First of all, the image of mother is extremely important for Stus. In his early poem of 1986 called Potoki, Streams, this address to his mother plays a very important role in the poem. And interestingly enough, yet again, even in that early poem, written 4 years before this one, Stus still uses the image of his mother to begin with as this very specific image of his own mother. But then throughout the poem, he starts to use it as a metaphor, and then comes back to it again, speaking about his own childhood in Donetsk. By the way, coming back to the question of the question that Yuri asked, Potoki streams, his poem in 1986 from his collection Zimovi Dereva, or Dereva as Stus called it, Winter Trees, is a really great text as well for Stus's description of and reflections on Donetsk. And so to come back to this question, in this poem as well, we can see that Mother, on the one hand, has this very specific practical, rather I shouldn't say practical, but individual connotation for Stus, right? Because he's separated from his family, and especially at this early time of his imprisonment, it was a very painful experience for him, as we can imagine. But throughout this poem and his collections more generally, or rather palimpsests more generally, we can see how he opens it up to this metaphorical meaning. And again, just to reiterate how important it was for Stus to overcome his specific experiences in real life as well. Whenever he would be asked about his health, for example, or he would be asked about something that had to do with his own experience, he would never speak about that. It was of no interest for him. This question of spiritual overcoming of the physical challenges they were going through was really central for him. So I suppose that would be a way to answer that brilliant question.
Thank you. And thank you, Laura, very much for the question. Bohdan, can we now take a couple more questions on the poem itself, or would you like to go
absolutely
introducing other
Let's
ideas?
go with those questions.
There was a question from Uyam about combining the individual experience with the collective experience. If we can get Uyam on video, that would be fantastic. I think he's coming up now. That'd be wonderful. And then after that, there was another question from Katerina Busol, if she's there as well. And that would be great.
It feels almost like a radio show where we are taking in someone's calls.
Yes, absolutely. Great. Here's Uyam.
Fantastic.
Go ahead.
Hi, Bohdan. Thank you very much for another really fascinating talk.
Lovely to
so
see
I
you.
had a, yeah, and it's great to hear more about these poems. So I had a question precisely about the lines that you were discussing before, about this line which says "Божити то не є долання меж, а навикання, а само собою наповнення." And obviously, on first reading, this feels like quite a private or personal or kind of introspective line. But my question was whether we can maybe read this more broadly. And I was thinking about what we're going through at the moment as a society, and the sort of the way our kind of obsession with precisely this question of overcoming our limits and expanding and growing and accumulating, whether it's, you know, economic or accumulating information or material things, you know, and these kind of things. And that the fact that in this situation at the moment we've been forced to stop, and precisely as you were saying at the beginning of your talk, you know, to kind of look into ourselves a little bit more, to get used to ourselves, get used to this situation. So do you think we can understand it in that kind of maybe a broader sense, in a collective sense?
Fantastic question. In fact, you know, as much as this format that we are in at the moment is quite limiting, it is also liberating in many ways, because here we are, a few dozens of people, essentially being in the same virtual space, right? And this is exactly how poetry works, right? This is a miniature example of this circuit of communication, if you will, of poetry. That on the one hand, there is this text, which seems to be the single text, but at the same time, we are in different parts of the world being able to be the readers and to read it, to read ourselves into it, as it were. And so that way, of course, it creates also not only this individual plane of existence so that we could enter it intimately, but also just exactly as we're doing at the moment, that we are able to go through this as a group as well, right? And of course, it is such a pivotal moment in terms of the challenges that we face as a society, and not just as a society, we should say, but as this global community, right? And I suppose that a good way to look at it as well is that the better we manage to engage in самособою наповнення, and the better we manage to understand ourselves and observe ourselves, the better we are going to, the more prepared we're going to be to hear each other. Because if we are able to, I think that this notion of hearing starts from ourselves. If we can hear ourselves first, I suppose that would be the foundation that we need so much to be able to hear the other as well, right? And to hear each other in society at large as well. But there is one respect in which it probably would be difficult to look at it in a collective way as well, because as I mentioned earlier, it is this notion of existential repetition, right? Which is probably not the most immediately accessible idea, but this notion of coming back again and again and again to the same sets of problems, right? So as a society, we tend to be willing to make some progress, to overcome these limits, to move forward, to learn from it. And for example, you know, when this pandemic, and this is a massive learning curve, we essentially live years in days now, right? Time has got compressed so much. So this is a huge learning curve. We're going to learn so much once this has blown over. But hopefully we're going to be able to move in economic terms and in terms of our healthcare systems as a society forward. But still, we will face the same problems in terms of love. What is the best way to be with the other, right? We're going to face the same problem of anxiety, being in situations that make us again and again engage into this process of searching ourselves. And I suppose that in that way, this process of самособою наповнення is inevitably individual as well. Right? So it really gives us the chance to learn more about ourselves and to come back to the same problems, but to find avenue ways to deal with them, just in the way Stus did it. And the final thing to say in answering this question is that a manifestation of how Stus was coming to the same questions but answering them in avenue ways is the fact that these neologisms, of which самособою наповнення is but one example, most of the neologisms are nonce words. So what are nonce words? Those are words that are used once. So when we look at the dictionary of Stus's neologisms, there are more than 70 words that contain this element of self, and each time Stus uses new ones, he doesn't repeat the same words. So that just gives us, again, quite a good insight into this repeatedly coming back to the same existential scenarios, but again, becoming and coming out of this experience as a different kind of self.
Thank you very much. William, do you want to respond to that? Yes, we could have a whole session just on that.
Yeah, no,
alone.
I think I'll go away and think about it more and let other people ask some more questions. So
we'll take Stus's advice on that. And
well, thank you so much, William. Thank you.
I think we've got Katerina Bohdan now, who also had a question to put to you. Katerina, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good evening. Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation, Bohdan. I'm sorry that I'm without the video because the internet is very bad. Two questions, if I may. You mentioned that Stus drew some inspiration from Boris Pasternak, and at the first sight they look quite different. Their poetry is so different. So could you specify perhaps a little what fascinated Stus in Pasternak's work and personality? And also, could you comment a little bit or compare rather the relationship of the two poets with the state, which was quite complicated? Thank you.
Fantastic. Great. In terms of Pasternak and Stus, really great question. It took me some time to actually believe Stus's statement that he was really influenced by Pasternak, because in his very short introduction, which is called Dvoje sliv Chitachevi, a couple of words for the reader, to his collection Winter Trees, or Zimovi Dereva that I mentioned earlier, Stus speaks about a number of poets and writers more generally. He had some impact on him and his style, and he really earmarks, as it were, this huge space for the influence of Pasternak, and really says that there was one point in my career, or there was one stage in my writing where I was too influenced by Pasternak, he says. And I was always trying to understand whether it's actually the case. And it took me some time, I must confess, to actually see those similarities. And they're not obvious, they're quite subtle because of the way Stus really incorporates so much. And this is another truly rewarding and significant attribute of Stus's poetry, this intertextuality, that he constantly is in dialogue with other poets and philosophers, even though we're completely we are not aware of it at all. And so with Pasternak is the same story. There are some moments in his poetry, in Stus's poetry, where if we read it closely and compare it to Pasternak's poetry, we can see the similarity on the level of images, on the level of metaphors, because Pasternak is most known for his metaphors, right? Where he very often, again, similarly to Stus, compares the material and the immaterial. So we can see that Stus sometimes uses the very images that Pasternak used, and sometimes he uses the model that Pasternak had recourse to, and tries to use this model as well. Very important thing to say here is that Pasternak's influence can be felt to a greater degree in Stus's earlier poetry, rather than his later works, where his dialogue with figures like Goethe and Rilke especially were more prominent. So for Stus, in his early poetry as well, in terms of the sound, in terms of rhythms, and in terms of the cadence, that's why he was drawing some inspiration and influence from Pasternak as well. Just as an example, you can read his poem, Stus's poem Zimovi Dereva, so the eponymous poem, the same title as the collection Zimovi Dereva, to see this melody and images of these trees that have their bare arms, and this image of a tree with its arms or palms or hands is something that is very Pasternakian, if you will. And very briefly, in terms of their relationship with the state, there are definitely very good points of comparison. Pasternak received a Nobel Prize. This was nominated for a Nobel Prize. Pasternak in the end didn't receive it because the Soviet authorities didn't let him to. In a sense, the Soviet authorities didn't let Stus receive or be awarded a Nobel Prize, because he died the same year where this campaign was taking place. In the same way, Stus and Pasternak, of course, were opposing the Soviet regime by different ways. So Pasternak was someone who was chosen by the Soviet regime to be the Soviet poet. And of course, this role wasn't comfortable for Pasternak, and he was really trying to help all of his fellow poets and rescue them from this deadly mechanism, deadly machine that the Soviet regime was. And so, but he was different. He was different to Mayakovsky, who was also assigned this role of the state poet, and in the end, we know how he ended, not coping with this role. Pasternak, there was one stage at which he actually refused to write any poetry, and he was really engaged in the art of translation, and it is to this period that we are really grateful for his absolutely fascinating translations of Hamlet, for example, by Shakespeare, and Faust by Goethe. Stus also was translating. He was translating Goethe to, although he wasn't a huge fan of Faust, to be honest. But in any case, he was a huge fan of Goethe, that's for sure. So Goethe is another point of comparison between the two. And of course, Stus was much more open about his resistance. He was much more subjective poet, introspective poet. But at the same time, his poetry was not just confined to that. And the final note is that in his later poetry, Pasternak was less enigmatic compared to his early poetry, and more seeking to be understood by broader masses, right, by broader public. For Stus, there was never a concern, there was never something he was thinking about. For one reason, for one thing, there was obviously no audience except for a couple of prisoners whom he was reading his poetry to. And for another reason is that the very nature of his poetry was such that he was really getting into this radical place of self-exploration that is quite different to Pasternak's.
Thank you very much. That gives us all masses to think about. Katerina, thank you for the question. And Bohdan, thank you. I'm very conscious that we're running short of time, and I feel very much that it would be a perfect ending if you could read us one last poem. But before we do that, if I can say very briefly to everyone, a couple of messages, a couple of announcements. We have another event next week, next Wednesday evening, when Natalia Humeniuk is going to be speaking to Oliver Carroll about Crimea. And that promises to be extremely interesting in a completely different way. So do sign up for that. That's going to be another Zoom webinar. And very briefly, I think we have Virlana Tkach on the call. Many of you may have been at one of her events at the Ukrainian Institute London last year. And she is going to mention very briefly another Ukrainian poetry event that you might be interested in. And then we will turn back and thank Bohdan and ask Bohdan if you can read us one more Stus poem, because that's really what we all came for. So Virlana, are you there?
I am. I'm not sure if you can hear me.
We can hear you perfectly. Thank you.
Okay, great. On the 24th of April and 25th, which is in 2 weeks, we have two events with Serhii Zhadan, which we were planning to hold in New York at the Ukrainian Museum, but will now be virtual events. And there are two very different events. One is with a group of New York poets, or actually one of them is from Boston, but the rest are from New York. And Zhadan, they will be responding in English to various Zhadan poems. And the other event will be a jazz music event, and it'll be Zhadan reading to music, and then also our actors reading translations of some of the poems. The time for that is in flux right now, because we're trying to arrange it so that you all could see it, at least one of the events. And I think the Saturday one we'll manage to do in the afternoon. The Friday one, I'm not sure. We're sort of in negotiations right now. There'll be information about all of this on our website, which is yaraartsgroup, all one word, .net. Thank you. And I hope you can join us.
Virlana, thank you very much. And thinking of you all in New York, knowing that New York is having a particularly difficult time at the moment. So greetings. Before we turn back to Bohdan, after the end of the event this evening, we're going to circulate a small poll online. We are, as you can see, piloting different ways of doing events while we're running like this. And it would be great to have your responses to those questions. Very, very brief poll at the end of this event. And now, Bohdan, I think you had one more poem, and it would be wonderful to hear that to round off with.
Perfect. So let me just share, if I may, very briefly, another passage from Stus, just to show you another remarkable neologism from him, before I will read a slightly longer poem. So this is an example of real Stus. This is an example of complex Stus, the one that truly pushes the boundaries of language and poetry. And I hope there will be a chance for us to delve into such complex poems. And here Stus uses, so само собою наповнення is a slightly more known neologism, And there is another one, which is not shorter and definitely as rich, and that I would just really like to share with you, and that gives us quite a lot to think about too. So I will read this passage, the English translation, and then I will move to the final poem to that way button up our special event tonight. Подоби – ось та признака і остання грань, котрої краще не переступати, аби лишитися вовіки вік собою і вивищеним, пробути вперед житті на припочатку спроб в недовонародженні. Not yet being born in you. Недовонародження. So I will just leave you to this neologism to unravel and unpack it. And as a final note, let me read this other poem by Stus. It is not one of his most complex poems, but I just really wanted to share it with you because it's definitely not part of textbook Stus. It's definitely not part of public space Stus, but it is very importantly relevant for the experience that we're going through today. And as we're going to read it in a second, I would just really encourage and invite us to think about the fact that it is a truly traumatic human experience that we're going through at the moment. But existence and the world and nature is not only about us, it's not only about humans. And in a way, in a major way, the crisis like the one that we're going through at the moment reminds us of the fact that we should think beyond ourselves. And so this poem by Stus, which reminds us that we need to remember our limits as well, is something that I would like to share with you. Я знав, що світ ховається од мене, що в кожній речі причаїлась річ, і назерцем блукає, і не хоче мені свій вид правдивий отслонити, бо втрачено довіру існування і приязнь між людиною і світом. Бо ж недарма малесенькі пташки мене сахаються, втікає риба, допіру людську постать запримітить, і квіти кволою красою хочуть од мене захиститися. Останній маленький скалок віри, що людина ще недоконана потвора. Все ж я думав, що гармонія світів не обійшла людини, а лише для неї назначила відстань. Ось твоя межа належання до світу, її не переходь. Ото і все. Але такого я не сподівався, щоб світ тікав од мене стрімголов, мов од зачумленого, щоби я збагнув нарешті, що найдальша відстань між світом і тобою заблизька для певності збереження живого, що лихо стало недосяжне. Боже, вселенський гріх, людський обліг серця.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful way to finish this evening. Thank you, Bohdan, for your insights and for the readings and for helping us either access Stus again or access Stus better.